All right. So I hope you understood what they are saying, right? That you cannot affirm the consequent, right? And you cannot affirm the consequent and deny the antecedent. It cannot be that way. All right. Okay. This fallacy is very common error in poor scientific reasoning and the one committed in many articles in technical analysis. Consider the following syllogism which commits the fallacy of affirming the consequent. If technical analysis rule X has predictive power, then it should produce profits in backtest. The backtest was profitable. Therefore, TA rule has predictive power. Both of these premises may be true, but the conclusion is not necessarily true. With respect to the first premise, it is true that the TA rule X does possess predictive power. It should backtest profitably. In other words, a profitable backtest would be consistent with the supposition that the result rule has predictive power. However, a profitable backtest could also be consistent with the supposition that the rule was merely lucky. Similarly, just as evidence of four legs is consistent with a dog, it is also consistent with all other four legged creatures. The fallacy of affirming the consequent is the reason that empirical evidence cannot be used to prove a hypothesis true. As, by, as we shall see, one philosopher of science, Karl Popper, contended the scientific method must therefore rest on denial. The other fallacy associated with conditional syllogisms is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Premise 1, if it is a dog, it has four legs. Premise 2, it is not a dog. Therefore, it does not have four legs. The fact that a creature is not a dog does not preclude its having four legs, right? Because you don't know. It might have four legs, right? Even if it's not a dog, you know, for example, it could have been a deer. It's not a dog, but it does have four legs, right? So that is again invalid. The fact, premise 1, if A is true, then B is true. Premise 2, A is not true. Invalid conclusion, B is not true. In logical shorthand, if A then B, not A, therefore not B. So whenever you're getting confused in the syllogism questions in the exams, just take the example of dog and remember what all we had discussed regarding it. Invalid arguments can be hard to notice when they concern complex subjects. The best way to reveal them is to plug in commonplace items for A and B and see if conclusions follows them from the premises. Figure 36.4 and 36.5 summarizes the preceding discussion of conditional syllogism. As mentioned, the great strength of deductive reasoning is its ability to deliver conclusions that are true with certainty. However, deductive logic has a great weakness. It is unable to reveal new knowledge about the world. All that a deductive argument can do is to reveal the truths, right, which is already there in the premises. Valid. Affirming the antecedent is valid. Denying the consequent is also valid. Denying the antecedent is not valid. Affirming the consequent is not valid. If A, then B, A, therefore B. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. That's not true. So I hope you understood the conditional syllogisms, right? The general form. And if you want to look at the particular thing in examples, that's also going to make things easier for you. So what is valid? If it is a dog, then it has four legs. It is a dog, so it has four legs. That is 100% true. Now, what is not true? If it is a dog, then it has four legs. Legs are not four, so it is not a dog. That is not true, right? Like you are denying the consequent, right? So if that is not something which is valid, okay? Denying the antecedent. If a dog, then it has four legs. It is not a dog, therefore not four legs. That's also not true. We just discussed. Affirming consequent. If a dog, then four leg has four legs, therefore dog, again not true. So I hope you understood it. This is not meant to minimize the trivialized deduction but to clarify its role. Okay, so that is deductive. Now let's talk about inductive logic. Induction is the logic of discovery. It aims to reveal new knowledge about the world by reaching beyond the knowledge contained in the premises of an inductive argument. However, this new knowledge comes with price of its uncertainty. Conclusions reached by induction are inherently uncertain, that is, they can be true only with some degree of possibility probability. Thus, notion of probability is also connected with induction. Now, induction proceeds in a manner opposite to deduction. We saw that deduction progresses from a premise expressing a general truth that is held. All men are mortal. To a conclusion about the specific instance, Socrates is mortal. In contrast, inductive reasoning moves, or better said, leaps from a premise based on limited number, and so on. Now, let's talk about the examples of inductive generalization. Now, what is inductive generalization? Each of 1000 healthy dogs had four legs. General conclusions: all healthy dogs will have four legs. The conclusion in this example is called a universal generalization because it asserts that all members of the class dog have four legs. Universal generalizations have the form: all x's are y's. 100% of x's have the attribute y. Generalizations need not be universal. Non universal generalizations can be p percent of x are y, right? That's what we just discussed. This many percent of the dogs would be healthy, and all percentage of that dogs would basically have four legs because they are healthy. So if there are 100 total dogs in the world, and if 90% of them are healthy dogs, so again, percentage came into the picture. Again, we see that probability is inextricably tied to the concept of generalization. In fact, non-universal generalizations are also known as probabilistic generalizations. An example would be a higher percentage of bulldogs are prone to violence than poodles. The statistically sound non-universal generalization does not claim all bulldogs are prone to violent um, right. Aristotle's defeat as scientist was in part attributable to his failure to appreciate that non-universal generalizations convey useful knowledge. His fascination with the certainty of deductive proofs helped him to restrict the search of universal generalization. Okay. Now let's talk about where did I go? Okay. Now let's talk about induction by enumeration. The most common form of inductive argument is based on enumeration. It proceeds from a premise that enumerates the evidence contained in a set of observations and then draws a general conclusion that pertains to all similar observations outside the enumerated set. Premise: over the past 20 years, there have been 1000 instances in which TA rule X gave a buy signal, and in 700 of those instances, the market moved higher over the next 10 days. So, what is the conclusion of that? In the future, when rule X gives a buy signal, there is a 0.7% probable 0.7 probability that the market will be higher at the end of 10 days. This conclusion this conclusion, or any conclusion reached by induction, is inherently uncertain because it extends to observations that have not yet been made. However, some inductive arguments are stronger than others and hence arrive at conclusions that are more certain. The strength of an inductive argument and the certainty of its conclusion depend upon the quantity and quality of the evidence. Suppose that the conclusion of the TA, suppose that a just a second conclusion about TA rule X has been based on only 10 instances with 70% success rate instead of 1000. In such case, the conclusion would have been at least 10 times more uncertain. This means we should be less surprised if a signal's future accuracy differs greatly from its historical success rates. The strength of an inductive argument also depends upon the quality of evidence. Evidence quality is an entire subject. So you need the evidence should to be of good quality rather than just a random thing. Now also, when you talk about something else about the strength of inductive argument is the degree to which the evidence cited is representative of the kinds of observation that are likely to be encountered in the future. An inference about the rule generates the most common fallacy of induction is its hasty generalization, and induction based on too little evidence or evidence of poor quality. Rule studies that cite a small number of successful signals as a basis of concluding that the rule has predictive power are basically not nice because they're really bad generalizations. Now, let's talk about the philosophy of science. The philosophy of science seeks to understand how and why the science works, right? It explains such things: the nature of science, scientific propositions, and how they differ from non scientific and pseudo scientific propositions. The way scientific knowledge is produced, how science explains, predicts, and through technology harnesses nature, the means for determining the validity of the scientific knowledge. The formulation and use of scientific method and the types of reasoning used to arrive at conclusions. That's everything which we just discussed is basically the characteristics of science, right? So that the scientific method is one of the man's greatest inventions and is by far the most effective method for acquiring objective knowledge about the natural world. Okay, so humans are Homo sapiens and we walked first in the earth many years ago, and so on. Okay, you can read this if you want to. Okay, now let's talk about Bacon's enthusiasm. What is Bacon's enthusiasm? Without invitation, philosophers poke their noses into all sorts of matters. It's their nature. They tell us how to act, which means ethics, how government should rule, that's political philosophy, what is beautiful, that is aesthetics, and one of the greatest concerns, what constitutes valid knowledge, epistemology, and how we should go about getting it, philosophy of science. The scientific revolution, in part, as a revolt against Aristotelian science. The Greeks regarded the physical world as unreliable source of truth. According to Plato, mentor of Aristotle, the world was merely a flawed copy of truth and perfection that existed in the world of forms, a metaphysical non-material realm, where archetypes of a perfect dog, perfect tree, and every other imaginable thing could be found. When the revolt against this view of reality finally arrived, it was harsh and unremitting. The new school of thought, empirism, resoundingly rejected the Greek paradigm. It contended that not only was the natural world worthy of study, but the careful observation could lay bare its truths. A pioneer of empiricism, perhaps the most first philosopher of science was Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon was basically the first philosopher of science. Okay, nature for Bacon was an open book that could not be possibly misread by uh, by an unprejudiced mind. In his famous work, The Novum Organum, Bacon extolled the power of observation and induction. He held science to be a completely objective, rational practice that could conclusively confirm or falsify knowledge simply by observing without bias and prejudice and generalizing from those observations. In many situations, the approach seemed to work. So, one of the biggest thing which Bacon followed was that there should be no prejudice or there should be no bias, and we need to look at the things objectively without any sorts of bias or any um all right. Bacon extolled the power of observation and induction. He held science to be completely objective practice that could conclusively confirm or falsify knowledge, right? We are human beings, right? So we obviously do have subjective kind of opinions, which means that everyone has different views and everyone has different opinions and all of that. But again, like in a way, if you think about it, it's not very easy to like um not be able to uh it's not possible for us to actually look at everything objectively, right? Sometimes you cannot really avoid the kind of bias which we have, since again we are human beings, right? So however, empiricism was not the perfect tool for Bacon and his disciplines claimed, and philosophers made it their business to say why. First, they pointed out that empiricism is an observation based enterprise rested on a crucial assumption that could not be confirmed by observation: the assumption that nature was uniform over time and space. All right. So, nevertheless, Bacon's contribution to the development of scientific method were important. He promoted the idea of experiment and made room for doubt by taking special note of discordant observations. Okay. So, science, first thing, the assumption would be critical in justifying how empirics position, or if a scientific law was observed to be hold true, and now it would also hold true everywhere forever, because the uniformity of nature assumption could not be confirmed by observation. It had to be taken on faith. Secondly, science often deals with the phenomena and the concepts that defy direct observation, right? For example, gravity and so on. Okay, so that is Bacon. So Bacon basically believed that there should be no bias and stuff like that when it comes to taking decisions. Next, let's see Descartes' doubt. If philosophers are good for anything, it's raising doubt, and no one was better than Rene Descartes, regarding as the father Regarded as the father of modern philosophy and a key figure in the birth of science, Descartes shared Bacon's skepticism for authoritarian knowledge of the Greeks and the dogma of the Roman Church. However, Descartes was just as skeptical of the claims made by the empiricists about the power of observation and inductive generalization. His famous expression, "I think, therefore I am," expressed the position that science must start by doubting everything except the existence of the person who experiences doubt. From the point of solidity, knowledge must be built purely by deductive reasoning without being contaminated by error prone observations. So, you need to always raise doubts, right? That's what Descartes says, that you need to keep raising doubts and you need to always raise doubts and you in order to before taking any sort of decision and so on. As a consequence of Descartes' anti empirical stance and penchant for theorizing in a factual vacuum, his scientific findings were almost meaningless. However, his contributions to science were lasting. Skepticism is central to the scientific attitude. In addition, Descartes' invention of analytical geometry paved the way for Newton's invention. Okay, so one more thing Descartes did was that Descartes also invented the analytical geometry. So when we talk about Bacon, you should know that Bacon speaks about enthusiasm, right? Bacon's enthusiasm. So what was that? It just meant that there should be no bias in your observations, and Descartes said that he was the one first of all who invented analytical geometry. Besides that, he said that we need to always raise doubts and we need to keep asking questions. Hume's critique of induction. Another dose of doubt was administered by Scottish empiricist and philosopher David Hume. His seminal work, the Treatise of on Human Nature, published in 1739, grappled with the central problem of epistemology: how to distinguish knowledge from lesser forms of knowing, such as opinions that happen to be true. Prior to Hume's publication, philosophers generally agreed that the distinction was related to the quality of the method used to acquire the knowledge. What justified calling one bit of wisdom knowledge but not another was the pedigree method of inquiry. Philosophers could not, however, agree on the best method of knowledge acquisition. Empiricists argued that the objective observation followed by inductive generalization was the route to wisdom. Rationalists, on the other hand, contended the pure deductive reasoning from self evident truths that was the correct method. So, I hope you know what rationalism is by now. So, what did Hume do? Hume basically took issue with both schools, right, of thought and ultimately even with himself. As an empiricist, Hume disparaged the rationalist purely deductive approach because it was disconnected from observed facts. Also, in the spirit of empiricism, he said that it was wise to adjust the strength of one's belief in proposition to the evidence. So, Hume attacked logical basis of empiricism. He denied the validity of inductive generalization and disparaged the ability of science to establish causal laws. His searing critique of induction has come to be known as Hume's problem. Hume's attack on induction was both on psychological as well as logical grounds. He said that the belief that induction could establish correlative or causal connections between events was nothing more than a byproduct of human psychology. From a logical perspective, Hume claimed that induction was flawed because no observed evidence, no matter how objectively collected, can compel a conclusion forced by valid deduction. Right? Obviously, now again, that would be very subjective in nature. So that's how Hume basically gave the criticism from his point of view. In light of Hume's attack, supporters of induction retreated to a narrower claim, saying inductive generalizations were merely correct in probabilistic sense. So, as evidence accumulates in favor of a relationship between A and B, the probability that the relationship is authentic also increases. However, philosophers were quick to point out that a probabilistic justification of induction was also flawed. The probability that A predicts B is equal to the number of times A was followed by B divided by the total number of instances of A, regardless of whether it was followed by B. Because the future holds an infinite number of instances, the probability will always be zero, no matter the past observations. Hume and his allies created a paradox. On one hand, there were seemingly valid concerns about the flaws of induction, right? On the other hand, there was accumulation of stunning scientific discoveries. So There was a very big paradox which was basically there. William Weibull, the role of hypothesis. It took philosophers and scientists 200 years of watching the scientific method succeed to understand how it worked and why so triumphant. By the middle of 19th century, it was becoming clear that science employs a synergistic combination of inductive and deductive logic. So then after everything happened, all the kind of paradox and discussion and various thoughts of scientists and various philosophers, and after repeated discussions and so on, then we have the role of hypothesis, and this was given by William Weevil. Now what did William Weevil say? First of all, William Weevil was the first one to understand the role of induction, okay, in the formulation of a hypothesis. Weevil called it a happy guess. He said that scientific discovery starts with a bold inductive leap to a new hypothesis, but it is followed by deduction. So he said that deduction must also be there, but every time you create a hypothesis, Weevil said that hypothesis has to be created with an induction. That is what he gave. That is to say, after a hypothesis has been induced, a prediction is deduced from the hypothesis. If the hypothesis is true, the specific future object observations are predicted to occur. Right. So that is what Weevil said. When the observations are made, they will either be consistent with prediction, thus confirming the hypothesis, or conflict with prediction and contradicting the hypothesis. X predicts Y, X brings about Y. If X predicts Y, then the future instances of X will be followed by instances of Y. Now this is what? Conditional proposition, right? The predictions embodied in the consequent clause of the conditional proposition are then compared with new observations. Now let's look at the outcomes. Um, if it turns out that future observations X are not followed by Y, or if removal of X does not prevent the occurrence of Y, then the hypothesis is proven false, right? If X, then Y, not Y, then not X. If, however, future instances X are indeed followed by Y, so if X, then Y, Y, therefore X. That is the prediction. Okay. So I hope you're understanding the syllogisms as well. Now let's talk about did Weevil basically agree with Hume or he didn't agree. Weevil agreed with Hume that inductive conjecture was a habit of human thought, but the habit that Hume was displeased, Weevil regarded him as fruitful and mysterious. Weevil's description of this crucial creative aspect of science reminded me of the conversation which I had with Charles, a prolific composer of the Broadway's most successful musicals. In my early 20s, short on time, I asked him to explain how he managed to be so productive. With more forbearance than I deserved, Charles described a daily discipline of religiously sitting at the piano from 8 until 11 each morning and 2 until 5 each afternoon, whether he felt inspired or not. He told me that he treated composing music like a job. During this time, he would test tentative melodies, musical hypotheses. He modestly attributed his high productivity to 99% discipline and 1% creative talent. However, as I thought about this conversation years later, it seemed otherwise, with an almost infinite number of note combinations. So, again, what did you understand by the story? Weebble's realization that proposing a hypothesis was an act of invention no less than creation of steam engine or light bulb. Everything which was ever invented in this world, everything started with a hypothesis, right? And hypothesis is created by induction first, beginning. So you need to have some sort of creativity and some sort of a vision in order to basically, invent something which is that um, fascinating. Now let's talk about Karl Popper, falsification and bringing deduction back into science. In two landmark works, Karl Popper extended the insight of Weibull and redefined the logic of scientific discovery by clarifying the role of deduction. So Karl Popper basically talked about the role of deduction. Popper's central contention was that a scientific inquiry was unable to prove hypotheses to be true. Rather, science was limited to identifying which hypotheses were false. This was accomplished by using observed evidence in the combination with the valid deductive form of falsification of the consequent. If hypothesis H is true, then evidence E is predicted to occur under specified conditions. Evidence E did not occur under specified conditions. Therefore, hypothesis H is false. In taking the stance, Popper challenged the prevailing view advocated by a school of philosophy called logical positivism. Just as Bacon had revolted against strictures of Greek tradition, Popper was in revolt against the Vienna Circle, the home of logical positivism. So, what exactly who were logical positivists? Logical positivists believed that observations could be used to prove hypotheses to be true. But Popper demurred, saying that observed evidence could only be used to prove a hypothesis false, but you can never use it to prove that a hypothesis is true. That is what basically Popper has told. Now, let me interrupt the other parts of this chapter. Okay. We've already seen that data cannot be used logically to deduce the truth of hypothesis. Attempts to do so commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent. However, and this is the key of Popper's method of falsification, data can be used to validly deduce the false hood of a hypothesis by denial of the consequent. In other words, this confirming evidence can be used to reveal a false explanation. For example, finding the other shoe would be evidence that would falsify the one legged thief hypothesis. The logical argument is as follows. Premise 1: if a one legged thief is responsible for my missing shoe, then I will not find the shoe in my house. Premise 2: missing shoe is found. Conclusion: therefore, one legged thief hypothesis is false. Popper's method of falsification runs against the grain of common sense, which is biased in favor of confirmatory evidence. Intuition often tells us to test the truth of a hypothesis by seeing if confirmatory evidence can be found. We do so understanding the mistaken impression that confirmatory evidence is sufficient to establish the truth. However, using evidence in this way commits the fallacy of affirming the consequence.